Shveta Miller. I am a new associate cohort member at the Educator Collaborative and a literacy consultant based out of Oregon. I am here to talk with you about close looking, which is a term I use to describe strategies for teaching students how to use close reading skills but with visual texts. I'd like to share a little background first about what brings me here today and to this topic. Almost 20 years ago, I started teaching high school language arts in New York City public schools. And I immediately saw that I had many students who struggled to read the complex grade level texts we were reading in class, that they struggled to read those independently. But I also saw that they were always able to contribute valuable insights during our oral discussions in class. So I decided to mix in more read-alouds of the key passages in those texts into our lessons to just make sure that students had more opportunities to practice and demonstrate critical thinking and analytical skills. So that eventually gave me the idea to use text types that didn't solely rely on words to communicate their complexity, so that all students could engage with intellectually stimulating content, whether they could fluently read the words independently or not. I knew that all students would benefit from hearing the insights of their peers with whatever text we were engaging with. When I made this shift to visual text, I saw my striving readers' confidence soar. Their curiosity was sparked and their motivation to create their own stories in different media formats built. More than that, their peers viewed them as intellectual scholars worth listening to. Today, I want to share with you some of the strategies that made that possible, because I want that for you and your students too. My goal for us today is that you leave feeling more confident to integrate visual text into your instruction, to accelerate your striving readers to grade level standards and beyond, and also to help all students become more engaged, thoughtful, insightful readers of the overwhelming amount of visuals they are engaging with every day outside our classrooms. I hope you leave understanding that visual texts like comics, graphic novels, but also images of all kinds, are not just a nice to have add-on for engaging students in reading, but actually an essential brain-based way to acquire new learning, retain knowledge, and sharpen analytical and creative thinking skills for all students. So this topic is large. In fact, I've written a book about many ways to integrate visual text into our teaching to accelerate striving readers, yes, and ensure all learners are engaging with meaningful, stimulating, higher level learning on a daily basis. But with our short 45 minutes today, we'll focus specifically on how to engage with visual texts with the thoughtfulness and attention they demand. Specifically, how to apply and practice close reading skills to visual text so that our students can move forward with key grade level standards and skills and have richer, more valuable, empowering experiences with visuals of all kinds. You'll leave today with actionable strategies you'll be able to use in the classroom tomorrow. I'd like to pause and give you a minute or so to put yourself in the mind frame of a visual text reader. I'm going to just ask you to simply pause and for 30 seconds or so, list 5 details you see in this screen, in this image. This is a 2-page spread from the graphic novel Irina, Book 1, Wartime Ghetto by Morvan and Treful. So just 30 seconds or so, list 5 details. Okay, thank you for doing that. And now I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to look again and list 5 more details. Okay, we are going to return to this exercise later in the session, so please keep that experience handy in your memory and keep your lists handy. I want to establish some context for why we would even want to devote instructional time to explicitly close reading visual texts. In their report called The Opportunity Myth, the New Teacher Project shares some compelling findings. They wanted to understand students' aspirations for themselves, what kind of lives they wanted to lead, and how school was preparing them to live those lives or letting them down, it turns out. What they found is that most students do what they're asked in school, but are still not ready to succeed after school. They cite statistics about college and career success. In the nearly 1,000 lessons they observed, students were working on activities related to class 88% of the time. They met the demands of those assignments 71% of the time, and more than half of them brought home A's and B's. Yet students only actually demonstrated mastery of grade level standards on their assignments 17% of the time. Now, demonstrating grade level mastery on those assignments would be a benchmark for being on track for the lives most of them wanted as adults. So that gap between the amount of work they were doing, complying with the expectations, submitting the work, getting the good grades, and only the 17% of that work that was actually grade level standards, that gap exists because so few of the assignments that they were given provided an opportunity for them to practice and demonstrate grade level mastery. So our challenge then is the New Teacher Project describes classrooms where students are primarily engaging with basic content, standards, and skills. And we know this leads to a sense of being behind, feeling deficient, that they're never going to be able to catch up, but also that by engaging with that basic content, they're inevitably missing the relevance to their lived experience. They don't have access to the actual knowledge and skill set that they really desire to have to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. And that content, that basic content and standards and skills is ultimately unengaging because it often lacks depth and complexity. So this leads to low motivation and a sense of low self-efficacy. So what we want our students to have is high self-efficacy and engagement. And we can do that by ensuring consistent and regular access to grade level content, standards, and skills to keep students in community with grade level peers with a sense of moving forward, a sense of real progress and accomplishment of things that are difficult and worth doing. So I've used the word acceleration a couple times, and I want to pause to make sure that we are aligned in our understanding of that. So when we talk about learning acceleration, we mean the intentional implementation of strategies that leverage students' assets and skill sets and funds of knowledge, their strengths and gifts, to provide efficient access to unfinished learning, prerequisite skills, foundational understandings, and to accelerate their learning and move every student toward mastery of key grade level standards and skills. Susie Pepper Rollins, in her book Learning in the Fast Lane, has a clear graphic to articulate the difference between a learning acceleration environment versus that remediation environment where students are stuck with engagement with basic content, standards, and skills, the environment that the New Teacher Project found overwhelmingly present in the over 1,000 lessons that they observed. So in an accelerated environment, students have that grade level skills and content. They're doing the lift, the cognitive lift. They're doing the interesting thinking. The work is so interesting because it's relevant to their lived experiences and their goals and the knowledge and skills that they want to develop, which means they're engaged. And we're also providing efficient access to unfinished learning so that students can be successful as they progress and move forward with grade level work. So as you see strategies that I model today with visual text, I want you to think about how those strategies, as students experience them, might increase relevance and engagement and allow students to do the interesting thinking while practicing grade level skills. I want to take a moment and also review cognitive load theory, which has been described as that single most important thing for teachers to know. And it will be clear later why a review of this is so relevant when we talk about why we need to integrate visual text in our language arts classrooms to ensure access and acceleration to grade level standards. So first, let's talk about cognitive balance. Cognitive balance is when there is sufficient processing capacity for the required load. So like the visual shows, when there's stuff to be learned, it comes into our brains through our small, temporary, limited, fragile, delicate, working short-term memory. Only so much can fit in there at one time, and it has to efficiently be moved out of that temporary spot into our large, long-term memory storage that actually has infinite capacity. It can just continue to grow and grow and grow. So we really want to move new information, new content, new knowledge, new skills from that temporary working memory that's very finite and limited into long-term memory. Now, you move stuff into long-term memory through repeated exposure, multiple modalities, and retrieval practice. And you move it in there by connecting the new learning to existing knowledge that's already in that long-term memory, what we often call our schema, what students already know well, the skills, knowledge, and dispositions they have, they're coming in with, their assets, their funds of knowledge. Now, cognitive overload, occurs when the load coming in outweighs the processing capacity. So we know that this very small short-term working memory has a limited duration, and when too much stuff is trying to get into that at one time, or there's already stuff still in there that hasn't efficiently moved into long-term memory, then we experience overload. So we need to connect what is already sitting in our short-term working memory to our existing schema, to what we already know how to do, what we already understand, in order to make space for that new learning. So how can visual text help decrease cognitive overload and maintain a cognitive balance? In a few ways. Dual coding, combining verbal and visual materials to enhance learning by blending information in our working memory and encoding it into our long-term memory. So when you get new information in both verbal, like the word dog, and visual, picture of a dog, it is more likely to efficiently process through our short-term working memory and be encoded into long-term memory. We can increase the retention of new knowledge and new vocabulary using primary activities that decrease the cognitive load. And activating multiple modalities. So if you've received information in multiple forms, like verbal and visual, that also increases how easily you'll be able to retrieve that knowledge back. So the more that we try to retrieve what we just learned from our working memory, the more strongly that's going to fit and stay in our long-term memory. And so if you retrieve that information in multiple modalities through physical movements, through drawing, through music, as well as writing and speaking, you are more likely to retain it in your long-term memory. Now, evolutionary biologists describe certain abilities as either primary or secondary. So a primary ability is one that we're essentially kind of born with, that requires very little learning to even get started with. So things like walking, we will naturally develop the ability to walk, to talk as well, and also to look. These are all biologically primary abilities versus secondary abilities, which are those that we have to learn. For example, reading, which needs to be taught intentionally in a systematic, sequenced way. So by leveraging visual text in the classroom, we are activating students' primary ability to already look. They already know how to look. So now they can read and write and discuss a topic at a higher level because they will have more cognitive capacity to do so. So for an example, imagine you are at a conference or a party or something, and you're meeting a lot of new people and getting a lot of new names. Some of us use a variety of strategies to learn those names, or our students' names. You might see that Calvin is taller than a lot of other people in the room, and well, there's that letter L in the middle of his name, that L that stands so tall. So visualizing his name and connecting that to who he is helps you encode, helps you dual code that information into your brain that you'll be able to retrieve and retain more firmly. Or imagine you're getting directions. You could read a list of directions written out in words, or someone can merely describe turn left, turn right, turn left, turn right, or they can incorporate visuals into that description to encode it more firmly in your working memory so that you may retrieve that more easily and then retain it in your long-term memory. Imagine how much more helpful it would be if you were told, turn left when you see a tree that looks like a hat. Now, a hat is something that's already in your long-term memory. That's some schema that you can connect, this new information. You can connect that firmly to something you already understand. So let's take a moment and reflect on that. Think back to that opening exercise we did with the arena 2-page spread. Did you experience cognitive overload or balance during that opening task, and why? So you might be thinking that you were activating your primary ability to look. You already had that ability, so you were able to maintain a cognitive balance by not being asked to do something that carried such a cognitive weight, and you were allowed to simply do the task at hand thoughtfully and carefully. So you might notice that you were in a balance because you were able to connect this task to schema already established in your long-term memory. Now keep that task in your mind because we're going to keep coming back to it today. So that brings us to this quote that I like to share by Kyle Redford from the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. Graphic novels he calls the grand equalizers. They invite all levels of readers into reading conversations. Since everyone can read graphic novels, everyone can talk about them, which I'm trying to say increases access to grade level content, standards, and skills. He also goes on to say, and talk they do. I love to witness how graphic novels allow everyone in the class to develop a passionate reading identity. But I want to remind us, it's not just about seeing yourself as someone who can read or engaging students with simply reading. That engagement isn't going to last unless students feel the work they are doing matters, that it's useful and valuable to them. Gives them power and agency, that they're actually doing something cognitively stimulating and challenging. We want them to see themselves as intelligent, powerful thinkers. So I've mentioned visual text and I've said the word graphic novels and comics a few times. So I just want to spend a moment clarifying our language here about what I mean by visual text. So when we talk about comics and graphic novels or comic strips or even a single panel cartoon, those are examples of sequential art, words and pictures working interdependently, meaning the words don't communicate meaning alone. They depend on the pictures, and vice versa. The pictures can't communicate the meaning alone. They depend on the words. But we're also talking today about other visuals like paintings or photographs, even memes and billboards and other visual advertisements our students engage with on a daily basis. The strategies we're going to talk about today are going to help our students become more engaged visual observers of all visual texts in their lives. So we can't do that if all we're doing is handing them engaging visual text without equipping them with the actual skills to critically and thoughtfully read them. So just like we don't expect to hand over a dense, complex grade level prose text to students and expect them to get value from it after a quick first read, we can't do that with visual texts, which many students are electing to read and devour them quickly, but often at a surface level only. I want to activate your own prior knowledge here and connect this newer information about close looking strategies to what you already know about close reading. So what I have here is language that I've copied and pasted directly from Common Core's description of what close reading is as a grade level expectation and standard in language arts. And side by side, I've compared that to what we're doing when we're closely looking at visual text, and how what you'll see is it's actually very similar, if not exactly the same, with really just the added work, the added complexity of integrating visuals on top of the words in the close reading, close looking experience. So for example, we'll see that, in close reading text, we are uncovering layers of meaning. And in close looking at visual text, we're reading the words and pictures to uncover the layers of meaning that are always embedded there. In reading word-heavy text, we develop an understanding and interpretation of the words themselves embrace larger themes and ideas evoked by the passage. And of course, we're doing that with visual text as well, but we're integrating that close reading not just into the words themselves, but into that interdependent relationship, often complex relationship between those words and the pictures. We compare and contrast the successes and failures of different techniques. Of course, we do that as we read more and more visual text as well. The close reading process for text-heavy books, for word-heavy books, is similar to the close looking process. So just as we reread a word-based book, we also re-look. You saw earlier in the session that you looked for 30 seconds, and then I prompted you to look again. Well, in the close looking strategies we'll share later, you'll see how many times students are looking and looking and looking again. Continued close looking for longer periods of time, building that stamina, pulling out more subtle nuances in images, layout, structure, and design. Notice on the left that in the close reading process, it says that our aim is to notice all striking features of the text, rhetorical features, structural elements, cultural references. Well, it's exactly the same in close looking. And it's interesting they use the word striking, which is often most associated with visuals. So of course we're doing that with the words in a visual text, but also with those added elements and visual features. At the bottom here, notice that we are interpreting our observations. We're moving from the observation of facts and details to drawing conclusions, making interpretations based on those observations. And of course, we're doing that with visual text as well. Observation, again, another word often associated with looking at visuals. And you'll see some strategies later today where students are really compelled to draw those conclusions and justify them with what they've actually visually observed in the visual text. So teaching students to closely look at visual text is not just for those in need of acceleration. I really want to emphasize that point. All our students are striving readers of visual text, and all students would benefit from an informed, intentional, instructional approach to helping them become engaged, responsible, insightful, thoughtful, highly literate visual readers and thinkers. So what we see across all students is that students are overwhelmingly consuming visual text by choice, but they're consuming them quickly without an awareness of the subtleties, nuances, and complexities at work in those texts. That means that they're also often misreading those texts by looking from limited points of view, reading in isolation, looking from only one perspective, jumping to hasty conclusions about all of what is happening between those panels, all of that work that they must be inferring. They're often seeking answers and correct interpretations, even when visual texts are explicitly taught by a teacher or guided by an instructor. When I've seen that happen, it leads to a still superficial reading experience and often inflexible thinking. And all of this means if students aren't taught a better way of reading visual text closely, they're developing this passive consumption of all visual media that weakens their critical thinking abilities and ultimately makes them vulnerable to manipulation. So we've established that a lot is going on in a visual text and that they warrant the same close reading dedication that those text-dependent, word-dependent texts do. And that close looking at visual text is a lot like close reading a word-dependent text. When we teach students to closely read, we teach them a lot of the strategies, the elements, and devices that are common to a genre, like memoir or fiction or historical fiction. Similarly, I've seen that it is a commonly used approach of telling students how to look at or read visual texts. Like, how do you read a graphic novel? Let's look at this handout of common devices and techniques that graphic novel writers use. So the strategies I'm going to share in a moment require that you don't do that. Let me first explain what can happen when we do tell our students what to look for or how to read a visual text, like a comic or graphic novel. In what has been described as one of the most famous psychological demos ever, researchers Simons and Chabris created a video where students pass a basketball between themselves. Viewers were asked to count the number of times the players with the white shirts passed the ball. They found that half of the people who watched the video and counted the passes missed the fact that a person in a gorilla suit walks right through the basketball players. It was as though the gorilla was invisible. Now, this experiment, they say, reveals two things. One, that we are missing a lot of what goes on around us, what is called inattentional blindness. And two, that we really have no idea we're even missing so much. So in the context of teaching, I believe it also reveals that when we tell our students to focus on specific elements or to look for certain things or that certain things are there, they miss quite a lot of what else is going on, to the point where they essentially miss everything. So graphic visual texts do differ from prose texts, those without visuals, and they also differ from texts that do include images, like picture books and articles with captioned photos or textbooks with diagrams. Comics and graphic novels combine words and pictures in unique ways, drawing on a range of techniques and elements. And when students aren't aware of the devices at work, their experience may be superficial. Even when they emotionally connect with a graphic story or learn new information about a topic through a comic, they're still missing the opportunity to glean even more. And at worst, they miss subtext, ironies, other nuances, potentially leading to a flawed interpretation. So, in an effort to support students to notice more of the craft and structure of the visual text, I see teachers often providing the comics terms, like on a handout or a glossary of graphic novels terms and devices, or they might teach them through a lecture or mini lesson. But what I found is that this leads to a hunt and find approach where students spot device examples in the work as they are defined on those handouts and don't closely examine elements, but only locate what they were told to find. They miss the gorilla. They discount elements that don't neatly match the definitions they were provided. They sometimes miss the techniques and elements that are more experimental or subtle or inventive, or the ones that are even doing more of the work on that given page. By allowing students to skip the cognitively challenging work involved in noticing and discovering the techniques and elements themselves, we create dependent learners without the capacity to look and think for themselves. So what's a better way? How can we equip our students with the tools to look for themselves, question what they see, look again with criticality, learn from what others see around them, and embrace complexity? So what I propose is that we teach close looking. Now, I've adapted this from what Sherry Tishman from Harvard's Project Zero has written about, called in her book, Slow Looking. And I love this quote from her. She says, when people take the time to look slowly and closely at things, they come to discern multiple ways that things are complex. I like that phrase, come to discern. I like that wording because it emphasizes that students are doing that cognitive lift and that it's a process. It's an uncovering. It's inquiry-based. It's not something that is passively done or that's handed to them, that's excessively modeled, or that they're told what to look for and what to find. So close looking, the strategies I'm about to model to you and briefly to go over quite quickly, as you see them, I want you to think about how do they help students uncover the intricacies of object systems relationships? How do they help students explore diverse perspectives? How do these strategies help students probe their own subjectivity, to think about, why did I see what I saw? And why did I miss what others saw? How does what I see, how does who I am impact what I see? How do the strategies help students participate in the text in the way that it demands? And how does it help them exercise agency in their experience of visuals? How are they seeing for themselves? So the strategies I'm going to share with you meet all these criteria. They can be used K-12, even younger and even older. Multiple content areas. Very little planning is required for most of them. They're all inquiry-based. There's a high ceiling and a low floor, so all students can access them, and the level of rigor and depth and complexity is very high. So there's really no limit of what students will uncover and the subtleties and nuances of their insights. These exercises are all collaborative. The more people, the better. They're dependent on the diverse perspectives, and they address the needs of neurodivergent students. As I share these quickly, it might be helpful for you to mark down a plus sign if there's a strategy you want to come back to, or you're not sure about, you have more questions about, or a star if you really want to try this now, or maybe an X. That's not realistic for me in my context just yet. So it's just a suggestion to keep you engaged as I go through these exercises. So the first one goes back to, again, that arena 2-page spread I gave you at the start of our session. Look at your list. Think about what happened when you were prompted to look for a second time. When I've done with this with students with that same 2-page spread, I've had students as young as 5th graders comment like, oh, it looks like a normal day, but there's barbed wire up at the top. Or they point out the color saturation. What the kids are imagining is in a very saturated tone. versus what's real is very grim and gray. Somebody noticed that, oh, the kids are all smiling, but the adults are all sad. Broken glass. They've commented on the details of the clothing. So think about what you noticed and how that changed and became a little more nuanced the second time. So when we use a look and list strategy, so what I did was a 5x2. I said list 5 things, and then we did that 2 times. And I gave you about 30 seconds for each time. You can adapt this to a 10x2, list 10 things, and let's do that 2 times, or a 5x3. Let's do this 3 times and see how your third list compares to that first. What else did you notice? Where are your eyes taking you? Which areas did you scan again and again and notice something else? So this can even be done with a very spare, deceptively simple image like the Calvin and Hobbes one you see here. When I've done this with students as young as 2nd grade, even their second lists show a lot of nuance and attention to really obscure details like, oh, only the tiger's one shoulder is showing. The tiger's lump under the blanket, his body lump, compared to the kid's body lump. There's more black on the right edge than the left. So we first start by looking and listing and really building students' stamina to look again. And what happens is that students ultimately learn that there's more to see than they thought, that they can always pull out even more details, and that it's worth taking a second look, even when they didn't think it was warranted. When this is done collaboratively with the teacher recording what each student notices on a board or chart paper, we create a collective vision and an urge to look more closely and an appreciation of all that's actually there. So of course, we don't stop with just looking and listing. We build on that. The See, Think, Wonder strategy is one I see used across content areas. But first, we have to give students that elongated, expanded time to first see, so to look, like using the 5x2. But then we want to prompt them to think about what they saw and to ask, what does that make them wonder? So you can see some examples here of what students have shared. I see a tiger awake in bed. I think, well, that's weird. I wonder, well, is he scared? Description is another kind of observation. By putting what you see into words, you revisit what you saw. Consider it more thoughtfully as you choose words to conjure it. As students name what they see and wonder about it, they begin to associate design elements with their effects. They begin to discover that there are visual techniques here, devices and elements at work, by looking for themselves instead of having it named and described for them. When we facilitate See, Think, Wonder as a group, we see the diversity of perspectives. One student thinks that the blanket means he's warm, and they wonder why the tiger's not sleeping, while another is wondering if the boy is going to help the tiger who looks scared. So we see the diversity of perspectives and how who we are, our backgrounds and our experiences influence what we see, what we think about what we see, and what we wonder about that. So these questions prompt students to make meaning from the depicted details. So a very common, so common that it's an acronym, WGOITP, what's going on in this picture? This is a common question used in visual arts environments, like in museums and art classes. By asking what's going on in this picture, this very open-ended question that invites all participants, all viewers to articulate something that they're observing in the visual, because we are attuned to describing things in narrative format. So by asking what's going on, what's happening, students are all invited to make a narrative about what they see. Then we follow that up with, well, what do you see that makes you say that? Now that sneakily compels students to look yet again, to return their looking back to that visual what do I see? And as they start to explain what they might see, they start to maybe question their claim or their narrative they were drawing. They might see that actually some of the details don't support that, or maybe they notice new details that make their description or their story more nuanced. By explaining how they know what is happening or how a character is feeling, they will casually point out intentional features like positioning, shading, choice of color, facial expressions, gestures, clothing, sizes, and start considering their effects. Now we can follow that up even more with asking, why do you see that? As we consider why we are seeing certain details, we begin to appreciate the intentional choices that were made to communicate events and feelings. Why do we see Hobbes's paws clutching the blanket? Well, how would it be different if his paws were under the blanket? The creator actually chose to make them over the blanket for a reason. Does it make him seem more human, maybe more childlike? Isn't part of the point of this comic that Hobbes is actually a stuffed animal that's anthropomorphized in Calvin's imagination? As we continue to redirect students back to the visuals to find more, we help them to continue to challenge first looks, first thoughts, hasty assumptions, to consider the possibilities. What more can we find? To learn what they thought they saw was wrong or too simple. To recognize the complexity of what's there, to consider how it was designed and the impact it has. Now, you might think that, oh, if I give students so much time to look at something really spare and really simple, they're going to get bored, or they're not going to pull out a lot, or the conversation's going to die, or, and that happens. So I want to share some strategies to prolong students looking so that they discover more complexity in the visual text, no matter how deceptively simple they may seem. Zooming into one piece at a time, making predictions and challenging them along the way. So you show a little piece of the image without showing the whole thing ever to them. So if we only look at the feet here, we might notice the slight bend in the knees. I've seen students make assumptions about the gender of these feet. That leads to assumptions about why the character has that bend in the knees. That maybe this is a meek position or stance, that this is a hesitant person. Now, these assumptions inevitably are challenged, and students have to re-examine their predictions as we reveal more and more of the story, where this actually becomes a very active character, a very dominant character. You can shift perspective, turn it upside down, turn it on its side, hold it at a distance, blur your vision, have students walk across the room and view the image from all the way from the back. They might notice, oh, well, there's certain elements that I can see from the back and other elements I can't. I can't make out Sluggo's face or facial gestures, but I can still see Nancy. What does that mean about who is the primary dominant character, active character, hero of this story? You can isolate each element. You can suggest categories to guide the eye, like colors, lines, or shapes. You can elaborate on the significance students observed when isolating each element. So, for example, without showing them the comic in its original format, I can just show students the panels with nothing else. Now, I've seen students draw conclusions about how the first two panel boxes, when added together, are exactly the same measurement of the final panel. And that helps them make predictions about what kind of story might fit in there. What might be included in that final panel. They notice the similarity that the middle panel is longer and thinner, and that helps them make predictions about what kind of story could we use this structure to tell. If I show them just the speech bubbles, students make observations about the spacing, the choice of font, the fact that it's in all caps, that it's the same words but drawn in different corners and different sides of the panels, helping them to draw other rich conclusions and make really astute predictions about how that might contribute to the overall experience of the comic. You could show just the facial expressions where students have noticed, wow, we get a lot of detail and upfront close view of Sluggo's face, but we never ever see Nancy's. And that helps them understand the final comic as they look at it all as a cohesive whole and think about why was that choice made? If Nancy is the hero after all, what does it mean that we never see her face? Why was that choice made? And what might have happened if a different choice was made? Use your senses, touch the page, scan it with your fingers, mark up the image, highlight, box off, annotate, use arrows to track the direction your eyes naturally follow. Then try a different direction. Compare that to the direction that often those guides and handouts about how to read graphic novels and how you have to follow it in a Z shape. Well, what would the story have been like if you followed that rule? And what was it actually like for you when you paid attention to what your eyes were drawn to? So this, I highly recommend checking out Nick Suzanis's Spin, Weave, and Cut. It's his website. He's a professor at SF State, a comics creator himself. Tons of examples of his students doing these visual annotation exercises. And as he says, the format is open. Students can trace, they redraw, they photocopy, they layer over the page, they analyze with acetate, anything in which they engage with the work in an intimate and visual way. Drawing directly on the page is key. This active interaction with the composition invites them to start noticing everything the author employs to construct meaning. After students move their hand and eyes over a page for an extended period, he suggests at least half an hour. So much spills out as they discover all sorts of things about the maker's choices and creative decisions not previously apparent to them. They find every square inch invested in meaning, he says. Similarly, let's talk a little bit more about copying the image. You can draw it the same, you can draw it bigger, smaller, with different colors. What else did you notice about the image while you were copying it? How did your changes, if you made any, impact the visual story? As Nick Suzanis says, engaging with the comic with your hand changes how you experience it and what you see. As we continue to probe what we see and consider what others are seeing, we will undoubtedly discover that we initially missed something, or that our first look was actually incorrect, and that there was more to see, more to consider. We begin to look with more care and intention. What else did we miss? What more is here? How who we are determines what we see. So this exercise, when done collaboratively in a group, help students notice what they are immediately drawn to in visual work and how that compares to what others see. What is significant about what we don't see? And what is problematic about that when we consider that often we're looking at images alone and not with others? So I want to remind you that close looking allows us to do all of these things. And now that you've seen many of these strategies, I want you to think about how students are exploring diverse perspectives and intricacies of objects and systems, and participating in the text and exercising agency and activating that primary ability to look and actually engage in grade level and beyond thinking. So I hope I've made the case for the value of providing the time and guidance and opportunity for students to carry the cognitive responsibility of looking closely at visuals to uncover layers of meaning. But that doesn't mean you can't ever provide resources about the terms and devices that are well known and part of the visual lexicon. Here are a few resources that do break down some key elements of sequential art and help students put language to what they are observing, like create a visual vocabulary. I'll just remind you that these resources are most helpful when they don't replace opportunities for students to closely look for themselves, but are simply used after students use their own language to describe what they see. We can then support them with more nuanced, precise vocabulary. So I hope you take a moment to reflect on how close-looking exercises help accelerate student readers, but also support all students to become highly literate visual readers. So some ways are listed here. Remember that looking is instinctual. It's something our students come to us knowing how to do. We can leverage a skill's strength in order to practice reading comprehension, speaking, listening, and writing skills that might be in need of acceleration. Remember that students are already looking all the time. So the high amount of opportunities to practice close looking outside of your classroom allows them the opportunity to really accelerate their analytical skills that they need to succeed with key language arts standards. There are so many ways that visual text can support learning in the classroom by building knowledge, increasing vocabulary, helping students show what they can do on formative assessments, stimulating creative and critical thinking, and even developing 21st century writing skills. There is so much that I talk about all of those other ways to leverage visual text in the classroom in my book and on my website. I hope you'll take some time if you're interested in this topic and really leveling up your instruction of comics and graphic novels, that you'll visit my website or reach out to my email or follow me on X as @Shveta Miller. Well, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I know you had other options, and I appreciate that you spent some time with me today. Thank you.